Lines were drawn across a map by people who had never lived there. No elections, no local voices, just a few diplomats, a pen, and a secret agreement made in the middle of a global war. Those lines would go on to shape countries, create conflicts, and influence the politics of the Middle East for more than a century. But what exactly was the Sykes-Picot Agreement? Why was it created in secret? And were its motives really about order or something much deeper? To understand this, we need to step into the chaos of World War I. At the time, the Middle East as we know it today did not exist in its current form. Much of the region was part of the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled over vast territories across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe for centuries. But by the early 20th century, the empire was weakening, its control over distant regions was slipping, and European powers were watching closely. When World War I began in 1914, the Ottoman Empire joined the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. That decision turned the Middle East into a major battleground. For Britain and France, defeating the Ottomans was not just about winning the war, it was also about shaping what would come next. Behind the scenes, both powers were already thinking ahead. Britain had major strategic interests in the region. It wanted to protect its route to India, which was one of the most valuable parts of its empire. Control over areas like Iraq and the Persian Gulf meant access to resources and secure trade routes. France, on the other hand, had long-standing cultural and political interests in regions like Syria and Lebanon. Instead of waiting for the war to end, Britain and France decided to secretly plan how they would divide Ottoman territories between themselves. In 1916, two men became central to this plan: Mark Sykes, representing Britain, and François-Georges Picot, representing France. Together, they negotiated what would later be known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This agreement was never meant for the public to see. On paper, it divided large parts of the Middle East into zones of control and influence. France would gain direct or indirect control over areas that would later become Syria and Lebanon. Britain would control regions that would later become Iraq and have influence over areas including parts of Palestine. But the agreement was more complicated than just drawing borders. It created overlapping zones, indirect control areas, and vague boundaries that did not reflect the realities on the ground. The people living in these regions, Arabs, Kurds, and others, were not consulted. Their identities, communities, and historical connections were largely ignored. At the same time, Britain was making other promises. To gain support against the Ottoman Empire, British officials had communicated with Arab leaders, suggesting that if they revolted against Ottoman rule, they could gain independence after the war. This created a completely different expectation, one where Arabs believed they would form their own independent states. So, on one side, there was a secret agreement dividing the region between European powers. On the other, there were promises of independence being made to local leaders. These conflicting commitments would later become a major source of tension. The Sykes-Picot Agreement remained secret until 1917, when it was exposed after the anti-Bolshevik Revolution. When the new Bolshevik government published secret diplomatic documents, the agreement became public knowledge. For many in the Middle East, this revelation was shocking. It showed that decisions about their future had been made without them, and in contradiction to earlier promises. After World War I ended, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the map of the Middle East began to change. Instead of full independence, many regions came under what was called the Mandate System, overseen by the League of Nations. In practice, this meant that Britain and France governed these territories under the idea that they were preparing them for eventual independence. Britain took control of Iraq and Palestine. France took control of Syria and Lebanon. New borders were drawn, often cutting across ethnic, religious, and tribal lines. Communities that had lived together found themselves divided. Others that had long-standing differences were placed within the same political boundaries. These decisions created fragile states from the very beginning. In Iraq, different ethnic and sectarian groups were brought together under one government. In Syria, diverse communities were grouped into a single state under French control. In Palestine, tensions began to grow as different political and national movements emerged. The effects of these arrangements were not immediately explosive everywhere, but they planted seeds of instability. Over the following decades, these borders and political systems faced challenges. National movements grew stronger, calls for independence increased. Colonial control gradually weakened, but the structures left behind continued to shape politics. Conflicts emerged over identity, governance, and territory. In many cases, these conflicts were rooted in how borders were drawn during and after the Mandate period. It would be an oversimplification to say that Sykes-Picot alone created all modern Middle Eastern conflicts. History is always more complex than a single agreement. Local politics, local rivalries, economic factors, and leadership decisions all played major roles. But it's also true that the agreement symbolized a broader approach, one where external powers made decisions about the region based on their own strategic interests, rather than the realities on the ground. This is why the name Sykes-Picot still appears in discussions today. It's become a kind of shorthand for foreign intervention, artificial borders, and the long-term consequences of decisions made without local participation. When people look at the modern Middle East, at its countries, its conflicts, and its political challenges, they often trace part of the story back to those lines drawn during World War I. Not because that moment explains everything, but because it set a pattern where global powers shaped the region's future, where promises conflicted with reality, and where borders did not always match identities. So, when we ask about the hidden motives behind the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the answer lies in a mix of strategy, power, and timing. Britain wanted to secure trade routes and resources. France wanted influence and control in key regions. Both wanted to ensure that when the Ottoman Empire fell, they would benefit from its collapse. The agreement was not designed to create stable, unified nations. It was designed to divide influence between two empires in the middle of a global war. And that is why its legacy continues to be debated today. Because the effects of those decisions didn't end with the war. They continued through decades of political change, independence movements, and regional conflicts. The modern Middle East was not created in a single moment, but the Sykes-Picot Agreement remains one of the most important chapters in that story. A reminder that lines drawn on a map can shape history for generations, and that the consequences of those decisions can last far longer than the people who made them ever expected.